virtually any other group. The Viking spirit drove them constantly to push beyond the next horizon. From their northerly homelands in Scandinavia, Vikings took to the rivers and seas. They drove east into Russia, reaching Constantinople and Baghdad. To the west, they assailed the coastlines of Europe and created colonies in Scotland, England, Ireland, and France. Vikings explored the Mediterranean, attacking Italy and Muslim territories in Spain and North Africa. Most impressive of all, Vikings crossed the Atlantic, establishing bases in Iceland and Greenland. They even explored North America centuries before the expeditions of Columbus. The 9th and 10th centuries were perilous times, and it was against a backdrop of rising and falling empires that the Vikings adventured. For most peoples, Vikings were terrifying. The sight of their dragon-headed longships on the horizon struck terror into many a villager. The Anglo-Saxons of the British Isles, the Carolingian Franks, and even the Muslims of Cordoba all battled Viking raiders, and all experienced shock at the swiftness and daring of their attacks. But Vikings weren't all violent raiders. Many of them were merchants and settlers. They engaged in trade from Baghdad to England and formed alliances with local rulers. Most notably, a band of Vikings joined the bodyguard of the great emperors of Byzantium. Vikings were brilliant metalworkers and craftsmen. Their longships remain impressive to this day. For every Viking who returned home rich with plunder, many others died in battle, or perished of disease in squalid military camps, or drowned in violent sea storms. These men risked everything for land, wealth, and fame. Their ethos prized courage over all else. Norse religion contrasted greatly with the monotheism of Christianity and Islam, which stressed submission to the supreme being and avoidance of sin. Viking gods were divine warriors, and life was a contest of valor. For the Norse, an immense ash tree named Yggdrasil lay at the heart of the universe. Yggdrasil's branches spread throughout the heavens, binding together the realms of the gods, frost giants, fire giants, elves, dwarves, men, and the underworld. At the dawn of creation, Odin and the first god slew the giant Ymir. The gods formed the world as an immense flat circle divided into 3 regions, each with its own inhabitants, but all centered by the core of Yggdrasil. The giants were banished to the outer edges, called Jotunheim, from where they plotted revenge for the killing of Ymir. From Ymir's eyelashes, the gods constructed a great fortress to hold the giants at bay, forming the middle realm, called Midgard. While walking along the primordial shore, Odin and his brothers came upon 2 logs washed up by the sea. From these, they fashioned Ask and Embla, the first man and woman. The gods gave Midgard to man as his home. For themselves, they took the central domain, the celestial kingdom of Asgard, home of the Aesir. Asgard reveals much about Viking attitudes. Asgard was the great hall of a celestial warrior king, a place for the gods to feast and hold court. From his great throne, Odin watched over the entire universe. Like the chieftains that honored him, Odin presided over his own household of warriors, the Einherjar, the bravest fighters fallen in battle. They dwelt in Valhalla, Odin's home, the house of the slain, a vast hall of gold with spears for rafters and a roof made from shields and armor. Each morning, the Einherjar marched out to fight and die in great battles. In the evening, they were magically healed and then returned to Valhalla to feast on mead and meat, only to march out again for more war the following day. The Einherjar were attended by Valkyries, beautiful female spirits clad in armor. At Odin's order, the Valkyries flew down to the battlefields of Earth to conduct the bravest of the fallen to Valhalla. Courage earned a Viking a place in Odin's household. For the Norse, Odin in particular was associated with wisdom. His gifts to man were the runes, poetry, and prophecy. Odin himself was relentless in his search for wisdom. Once, he allowed himself to be hung from Yggdrasil for 9 days to uncover the secrets of the runes. However, the most popular god was Odin's son, Thor, god of thunder, who protected men from giants with his magical hammer. Small Thor hammers were worn as protective amulets by travelers. Of the goddesses, the most widely invoked were probably Thor's wife, Frigg, called upon by women in childbirth, and Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. The location of Midgard conveys the Norse sense that humanity exists between the order of the gods and the elemental chaos of Utgard, the outer world. Between Midgard and Utgard lay the sea, inhabited by an enormous serpent, which encircled the world and bound it together by biting its own tail. Yggdrasil's heights reached to the sky, and its roots penetrated a subterranean well called Urd's Well, where the gods held their assemblies. Yggdrasil symbolized the cyclical nature of life, bringing water up from the well and dispensing it throughout the cosmos. The universe of Asgard, Midgard, and Utgard, with Yggdrasil at the core, mirrors the Norse conception of their own society. At the center stood the farmhouse, ringed by the cultivated land, with dangerous wilderness lying beyond. Although Utgard was chaotic and frightening, it was understood to contain the elemental matter necessary for creation and the discovery of wisdom. And so the Vikings journeyed beyond the Midgard of their homes to penetrate the far-flung chaos of the seas, eager for discovery. A Norse family cultivated near their house a house tree, a symbolic core representing Yggdrasil and the stability and centrality of the household. Historian Robert Ferguson writes, "Whatever else it was, northern heathendom was not the absence of a culture. Viking-age Scandinavians had their own cosmology, their own astronomy, their own gods, their own social structure, their own forms of government, and their own notions of how best to live and to die." By the middle of the 8th century, changes and growth in Scandinavia were bubbling over and would produce the burst of activity, including the incredible seafaring journeys that would come to define the Viking centuries. From the moment he became king of the West Saxons, Alfred the Great was confronted with the mortal threat of the Vikings. But Alfred had considerable experience as a commander, having fought alongside his brother, the late King Athelred. In addition, Alfred was plagued throughout his life by a medical infirmity, described by the king's friend and biographer, Bishop Asser. Today, historians believe this may have been Crohn's disease, a chronic illness that can go into remission for long periods, but is terribly painful during flare-ups. Despite this ailment, Alfred was a very active and dutiful ruler. The condition did not prevent him from fathering children. Joanna Arman estimates that Alfred's first child and firstborn daughter, Athelflaed, was born around this time in roughly 870. Alfred the Great was crowned during a period of profound turmoil. To the English of the time, it must have seemed like the end of days. The Vikings had destroyed all but 2 of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain. Kings had been martyred, houses of God had been despoiled, monasteries left in ruins. The thriving trade of the 8th century had broken down. Learning was at a low point. Alfred would later complain that south of the river Humber, there was scarcely a literate priest left. A month after Alfred the Great took the throne in 871, he faced 2 Viking armies on the battlefield near Wilton. The Viking coalition was formidable indeed, its ranks multiplied by the presence of the Great Summer Army. In this engagement, the Anglo-Saxons were defeated, and Alfred concluded that he could not eliminate the immediate threat to his kingdom without buying off the invaders. This was an old but never permanent solution to Viking attacks. It often only invited further hostility, and increasingly Alfred was not capable of maintaining this financially ruinous policy. The king's own estates could not produce the Danegeld, and so it had to be raised from the people of Wessex and from church estates. The following year, the great heathen army took steps to consolidate their gains. Under the Viking chieftain Halfdan, they moved into Mercia. Here, the Vikings set up base in Repton during the winter of 873-74. Northumbria and East Anglia were already under their control. In the past, Wessex had brought aid to Mercia, but not this time. The Mercians were powerless to overcome the Danes. King Burgred and his wife were deposed and went into exile. Burgred fled to Rome, where he died the following year. His wife, King Alfred's own sister, finished her days in a nunnery. Never again would an independent king rule Mercia. Instead, the Danes established their own puppet ruler. The following year, the Danish host divided. Halfdan marched north to consolidate power in Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply states, Halfdan shared out the lands of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plow and support themselves. This passage has invited much debate. Did the Vikings seize land from the locals, or did they purchase estates from native lords with the treasure now weighing down their coffers? Whatever the case, it's clear that Halfdan's company settled in York as a permanent home. Here the land was fertile and opposition non-existent. This was an ideal place for these Danish adventurers to settle in and put down roots. Place names of the region today indicate the mixing of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon language. As the former raiders became cultivators of the land, there was also an interaction of peoples, even cooperation and trade. Vikings were marrying into the local population. And it was not just warriors arriving from the Scandinavian homeland. There is evidence that the Danes were bringing their women with them as well, another sign that the Vikings were settling in as farmers and no longer acting as mere raiders. Meanwhile, the summer host under Guthrum remained in Mercia. They established a base at Cambridge for the year. Guthrum's ambitions were now focused on the final unconquered territory in England, Wessex. In 876, Guthrum's army entered the kingdom. They evaded Alfred's army, seizing Wareham in Dorset. At first, Alfred besieged the enemy in their stronghold. He was forced to withdraw when he learned of a large Viking fleet cruising along the coast of Wessex, intent on reinforcing Guthrum. Once again, the king had to negotiate. Guthrum swore to leave Wessex and gave hostages as assurance. This time, however, Alfred wanted a stronger guarantee. Guthrum agreed to swear the oath on a holy ring. This was a solemn practice among the Vikings, and the ring used on this occasion has been identified as a Ring of Thor, a large gold band worn on the chieftain's arm, used by the Danes themselves in the exchanging of oaths. Nevertheless, Alfred's effort at appealing to Viking piety proved useless. Guthrum did not keep to his vow. Perhaps the Viking leader was adopting the advice of Odin from the sayings of the High One. If there's a man whom you don't trust, but from whom you want nothing but good, speak fairly to him, but think falsely. Guthrum and his men murdered their West Saxon hostages, then slipped away by night to Exeter. The fleet mentioned earlier was at this time destroyed in a storm off the coast of Swanage. This resulted in the loss of some 120 ships, a serious blow to Guthrum's efforts. Following the storm, Alfred and his forces encamped before Exeter. The king refused to attack the town to dislodge the invaders, but the Saxons were well positioned, and Guthrum was unable to resupply his army. Once again, the two sides came to terms. Having terrorized Wessex for more than a year, Guthrum finally withdrew in August 877. Meanwhile, discontent was brewing among the West Saxons. Many were frustrated with Alfred's handling of the Viking menace. The Archbishop of Canterbury wrote to the Pope, complaining of the king's practice of paying off the Danes. Recently, some historians have suggested that high-ranking members of the West Saxon nobility may have even tried to depose Alfred. This may be why the kingdom was so woefully unprepared when Guthrum attacked again. The king was celebrating Christmas at Chippenham when the Danes arrived and began spreading havoc. The Vikings had executed the maneuver brilliantly, achieving total surprise. And if, in fact, Alfred's regime was collapsing and a coup was in progress, this would have left the king and his All right, everybody. Welcome. Let's fix this here. Okay. Welcome to Coffee and the Crusades, everybody. The Real Crusades History live stream. Let me just add in our guest here today.
Hello.
All right. Hey, Sam, how's it going?
Good. Happy to be on the show, and nice to see everyone in the chat.
All right, Sam is here. You guys may know Sam as one of our regulars in the chat, and he is currently studying the Ottoman Empire in Turkey itself. Isn't that right, Sam?
Yep. So I guess maybe if you want me to talk about my background just a little bit.
Yeah. First of all, can everybody hear both of us? Okay. Just let us know in the chat if we're sounding decent. And on top of that, I will go ahead and just in case somebody wants to send a paid question, that is available too. I'm going to open that up real quick. That is through powerchat.live. You guys will see that in the description down below. I will keep an eye on that just in case somebody wants to use that. Looks like we're getting a thumbs up on the audio, so that's good. And then lastly, I'm going to share the link for Knights of the Cross. In case anybody hasn't seen that yet, check out knightsofthecross.com to see what we're doing over there. And with that, let's let Sam tell us a little bit about your background. Yeah, just kind of like how you got interested in the Ottoman Turks.
Yeah. I guess it wasn't really. I mean, I always wanted to study history, and when I was in graduate school, I thought my focus was going to be on the United States and Southeast Asia. So totally different topic. And then I had a semester where I had to take some graduate seminars in my first master's program. And the choices weren't great. And there was this one Ottoman history. And I thought, well, what is this? I don't I don't know anything about that. And I ended up taking it, and I got really interested in the language, first of all, just kind of for fun. But the history was very interesting. And I found as I got into it, there was a lot to discover. So that's when I decided, and I had a very good mentor who spent many hours with me to teach me to read Ottoman. And that's when I got into it. And then I finished that degree, and I went to Hungary for about 7 months. I was on a research fellowship there. So I got to spend time there. That was pretty good. And then now I'm taking another degree, master's degree in Turkey. And I live here in Istanbul now. And that's my academic background. And mainly my focus is on Ottoman military history in the 16th century, and mostly working on Ottoman manuscripts, as opposed to state documents and things like that.
And so, as usual, guys, we do want to prioritize questions from the chat. So this would be a good opportunity if anybody wants to kind of discuss the Ottoman Empire or has some questions about Ottoman history. I think Sam would be a good person to address those two today. So yeah, fire up with the questions about the Ottoman Turks, and then I'll go ahead and open up with a question myself, and that's just kind of a broad one. So Sam, just in general, what is it about the Ottoman Turks that you find interesting? If that's not too big a question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think they were able to really, in terms of the Islamic world, they started out as kind of a nomadic, small entity in Anatolia, sort of on the frontier with the Byzantines. So this would be the 13th century. And out of all these nomadic Islamic states, they were really able to turn the corner from a nomad nomadic sort of configuration to a big and really successful centralized empire. And they were able to, most of their history. And so there's a lot there. And, militarily, it's a very rich topic. There's so many, obviously there's so many Ottoman wars, and they were very successful militarily. I don't think, anyone can deny that. And, they had a very high culture. I mean, in terms of elite culture, produced a lot of literature, art, poetry. So it's a very interesting subject.
So it looks like Alexander has a question on that. Did the Ottomans have a nobility? I guess you mean like a noble class there, Alexander?
Yeah, that's a good question. So not exactly, not in the way we might think. So in the Ottoman Empire, there's no titled nobility. So it's not like you would have in Europe, someone's the Duke of, I don't know, whatever, Duke of whatever place, and you get transfer that title to your son. It doesn't quite work that way in the Ottoman Empire. So you are given, let me back up for a second. So the way the land is parceled out in their sort of feudal system, you're not given a title to the land itself. You're given a title to the revenue. If that's not too confusing. So it doesn't pass through your family. And so my point is, there's no consistent nobility as such in that way. But there are very powerful families throughout Ottoman history. And there is a kind of nobility, just somewhat different than you might expect coming from European history.
And looks like Lambert over here has the question, how did the Ottomans begin their conquests? How did they attract other Muslim groups to their cause?
Yeah, so they were not really popular with other Muslims at first. That might sound weird, but at first they are directed against a weak Byzantine Empire, and they're raiding in the 13th century. So this is under Osman, the founder, and his son and successor. But as they grow in power over until about 1402, they are less and less popular with the other Turkic beyliks in Anatolia. So it's okay that they're kind of fighting against the Byzantines. That's fine. But the minute they start to sort of step out of line, they become very unpopular with the other Muslim groups. But as these things go, these are, again, for the early period of Ottoman history, when it's just a small beylik, we would say, it's not. They attract Muslims from all over, from within Anatolia, people coming in still from Central Asia, because they're fighting. They're fighting against the Byzantines, and this is a concept in Ottoman history. It's really debated. I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but the Gaza or Ghazi ethos of waging holy war against the Byzantines. But on the other side of that, the other thing that they're able to do is, Anatolia at that point in the 13th, early 14th century is kind of depopulated, and there's not a lot of security. So one thing the Ottomans are able to do is to give some kind of order to what they control and sort of regularize commerce and that sort of thing. Because one of the Ottoman chronicles even goes into how there's a Byzantine city, I forget which one, but basically they just sort of give up because the Byzantine state is going to do nothing to help them. And, the commander, according to this source at least, says, okay, whatever, the Byzantines are useless. The Byzantine state is useless. I might as well just throw in with these people. Not that they like the Ottomans necessarily, but, how these things sort of go. I think from reading Crusades history.
Yeah, and on that note, that kind of brings up another question I had. But I do want to prioritize chat's questions, but it just kind of is interesting to me. I mean, obviously the decline of the Byzantine Empire is a key part of the story of the rise of the Ottomans. And I'm just kind of curious, what do you think? Like, do you think that? I mean, we were talking last week about the Fourth Crusade a little bit. I mean, do you think that, for example, the Fourth Crusade was kind of a decisive thing that helped weaken the Byzantine Empire? And what do you think kind of happened to lead to Byzantium becoming so weak, in the face of the Ottomans? And do you think there was any point when they could have turned that around, or?
Yeah, that's also a good question, because that is a big part of the puzzle. Especially when you're looking at very early Ottoman history, you kind of have to read the Byzantine stuff too to get a complete picture. And I think by the time the Ottomans come onto the scene as sort of a small state, let's say, I just don't think the Byzantines are able to pull things together. And I watched your Fourth Crusade video, and I kind of agree with your overall assessment that Fourth Crusade, I think, is a big deal. I mean, it was a serious event, but it's one piece of the puzzle, and Byzantines kind of recover here and there, but they just are never quite able to get things back on track. Actually, there's a recent book about the Ottoman conquests I can recommend, and the author goes into some of the stuff the Byzantines were doing, where they were trying to rebuild, and they might have been able to resist the Ottomans a bit longer, but there were some contingent events that happened that it wasn't successful. But it's the book, if people are interested, it's called The Last Muslim Conquest.
The Last Muslim Conquest. Okay.
Yeah, and it's by a Hungarian historian. His name is Gábor Ágoston. But very good book, and it's probably a pretty good general account, I would say, of the Ottoman conquest up to about 1700, give or take.
And okay, let's jump back into chat questions here. Xenex says, "Does Sam have any comments on the siege of Zikdavar?" I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Oh yeah, Zikdavar.
During the siege, Suleiman died. Could you talk about Suleiman in general too? So
at the siege of Zikdavar, yes, Suleiman dies, and the I think a lot of and Suleiman in general was, how should I answer this? Yeah, he was a very capable administrator, and he was a good general. I think the problem with Suleiman was he was not always, the strategy against the Europeans was not always clear cut, and this might seem kind of random, but I think when people look at those maps, especially of Ottoman conquest, it makes it look like it was this very linear process. Where Suleiman is not always directing his energy against the West. They go back and forth between Hungary and dealing with the Safavid dynasty in Iran, who was a big enemy of the Ottomans throughout their history. Zikdavar, he dies there, and I think, and that kind of throws the empire into a little bit of a flux for a period of time, because his son Selim II is not as capable, let's say, as Suleiman was.
And let's see here. This is kind of a bit of a random question. Were there dungeons in the East? I heard there weren't any dungeons in Western Europe.
Were there dungeons? I
kind of depends on how you define dungeon, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, there are other methods of Ottoman execution, let's say. I don't know if YouTube will let me go into detail. But dungeons were not one of them, as far as I know. I know later in Ottoman history, when they go away from, let me give context. So in the earlier Ottoman centuries, it's basically a civil war to determine who is the successor. But in later Ottoman centuries, the other claimants to the throne are basically, in one of them at least I know, is sort of imprisoned until the Sultan dies and the succession passes to him. So that's a kind of dungeon, I guess. But you're still in the palace, so I don't know. Yeah.
And then we got Zytron here. How was the passing of power handled? All I ever hear about is the assassinations, but what was the official system for choosing a new leader? I guess that would be the Sultan.
Yeah, so it's the Ottomans are part of what we would call in sort of the scholarship the Turco-Mongol tradition. So there's no primogeniture per se. All sons of the ruler have an equal sort of stake, and basically until I think it's about Murad IV in the 17th century. It's whoever can get to the throne physically first. And so there's there's always going to be a power struggle. And for the earlier centuries, and then whoever wins that is the Sultan, basically.
So now I have a question here too.
Yeah.
Just in regards to the transfer of power, it does seem like when we're looking at the Turkish world, the Muslim world, you do get more of the assassination type thing. The Mamluks, for example, it's like one after another, the rulers are assassinated. Do you think there's like kind of this fundamental difference between Western and Muslim political systems, like a difference in stability that maybe resulted in this?
Yeah, I think, like I said, it's that Mongol, the tradition they get from the Mongols, really. And so it makes things a lot less clear cut. Mamluks are kind of a unique case, interesting system, a little messier. I mean, in theory, the Ottomans see this as perfectly stable because the idea is, well, the best ruler is going to win, essentially. And sometimes
so maybe it's a little bit of an idea of perspective. Like from a Western perspective, it seems chaotic, but there actually is something in a process there that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, it's not the most civil from our point of view way of handling things. But from their perspective, it's, well, God is on the side of the winner, basically. And you see that, and sometimes it does sort of spiral out of control. You see this with basically the Ottoman interregnum after Timur almost destroys the Ottoman Sultanate at the Battle of Ankara. And it's about let me fact check myself here. I think it's about 10 years. I should know this. Yeah, it's 1402 to 1413. So about 11 years of basically civil war. And then it's
pretty early in Ottoman.
Yeah, pretty early. And then sorry, I'm just seeing who. Yeah, Mehmed I is the one that takes over after that. But but it's not always like a big war necessarily. So like one of the sultans I study, Mehmed III, he's the one, I think it's him. He kills something like 27 siblings, to take the throne. And that's all inside the palace. There's no big military confrontation there, but yeah, that's the idea. But as I said, they gradually move away from that, and the power transfers to like the next oldest brother.
Okay, and so let's get a couple more here. Lambert says, would you say that the Mamluks paved the way for the Ottomans through their policy of destruction and razing cities, leaving little chance for populations to thrive? I think he's talking about especially their policy on the Syrian and Palestinian coast, which is a bit earlier than the whole Ottoman thing. But
Yeah, that's a good question, because to be honest, I'm interested in the Mamluks too, and the scholarship on them in English is not there's not as much of it as you might think, and a lot of Mamluks do go into Ottoman service after they're conquered in 1517. Was there an inspiration? I'm not sure. I will say a difference between the Mamluks and the Ottomans is that the Mamluks did not have very good sea power, but the Ottomans definitely made sure to cultivate more of a naval presence over time. So port cities for the Ottomans are really important. Mamluks, I'm not sure. I wish I could give a better answer.
Let's jump over. Zenix had a couple questions, and this kind of leads to something I wanted to ask. I mean, I guess this is the topic everybody likes to get into. I mean,
Yeah.
what is it about the West? The West seems to have had a lot of trouble dealing with the Ottomans for a long time. I mean, it's like a couple of centuries that the Ottomans are really, they have the initiative, and the West is kind of like struggling to hold them back, often not able to hold them back. What do you think about the confrontation between Christendom and the Ottomans, and why were the Ottomans so successful for so long? If that's not too broad a question.
Yeah, I mean it's broad, but it is. I mean, I understand why people ask it. I mean, I think I would get back to what I said earlier, is that I think built into that there's an assumption that the Ottomans did always have it together at all times, which is definitely not the case. And because they have a lot of, and they definitely have defeats, more than just Lepanto. I know that's the one everyone likes to go to, which is a significant defeat for them. But yeah, I would say really the advantage they had was it was really just a lot of contingent factors. So I think Charles V really could have dealt a serious blow to them. But think about it, if you know anything about his situation. I mean, he's got to deal with the Protestant movement in Germany. France is allied to the Ottomans in the early 16th century. So they're kind of, he's the one that I think, and the Spain and the Habsburg lands could have probably done a lot more damage to the Ottomans, but there's just all these things that they have to juggle. And the Ottomans have to juggle a lot of things too. They're fighting, especially in the 16th century, they're fighting their own kind of religious war with the Safavid dynasty in Iran, who are Shi'i Muslims. Ottomans are generally Sunni. And there is a movement of, Muslims within the Ottoman Empire who are considered heretics by the ruling religious establishment. So, the Ottomans aren't as strong as they appear at that time. But at the same time, the Europeans are kind of divided. And it's really a similar problem they had early in the Crusades. These Christian rulers, no one can quite get everything together. I hope that's maybe a satisfactory answer, but that's it's a big topic.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the impression I tend to get too. I mean, you see, especially it seems like in kind of the Eastern and Central European campaigns, I mean, you have smaller kingdoms kind of trying to cooperate, not always cooperating effectively. Meanwhile, actually, Zenix kind of addresses this a little bit in this question too, like how a lot of times the West was kind of slow to react to the Ottomans. Like, maybe if the Hungarians or the Poles were asking for help, France and England and these other places were disinterested. So that seems like that's part of it too. But this is kind of an interesting question. How did the West become more alert to the Ottoman threat? How does that strike you, Sam?
I mean, it was always, especially by the 15th century, I would say. I mean, they knew, like János Hunyadi and the Hungarians knew, okay, we got to deal with these people, basically. But even that was another case of nobody really wants to help the Hungarians. But also, I think, when you look at these events, we see the whole picture. Like when Hunyadi wins at Belgrade, if I have my chronology correct, I mean, he basically guarantees about 50 years of peace between the Hungarians and the Ottomans. And I mean, that's like someone's lifetime, basically. I mean, so that's, that's pretty significant for in that moment. And sorry, I was just looking at another question because I'm thinking about the 15th century.
We can jump
have
to
you
another
ever
one if
talked
you want.
about the Crusade of St. John Capistrano in 1456? I have not. I've not heard of that. I'm interested. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, same here. And let's see. So Zytron was asking, can you remind me of differences between the two Muslim sects,
Yeah. So the
Sunnis and Shia?
Sunnis, it's about the succession to Muhammad. So Sunnis believe in the very simply, Sunnis believe in succession through the caliphs, which don't necessarily have to be related to Muhammad. And then Shi'is believe in succession through Ali, who was Muhammad's nephew, I believe, but basically a blood relation. That's the basic sort of issue. I mean, there's a lot more there, but as it relates to the Ottoman period, it's sort of the Shi'ism is enshrined in Iran through this Safavid dynasty, and it's sort of a charismatic kind of mystical movement that the Sunni leaders in the Ottoman Empire, the Sunni scholars, kind of take issue with for different reasons. But that's sort of the basic kind of gist of it.
Yeah, I know one way I've heard it explained is, the idea for the Shia is that Muhammad has a blood successor, and the Sunnis don't think that's necessary, which is, why that might go to some extent to explain why Sunni Islam has been so much more successful, because it can be any capable leader, of the Muslim community. And that's kind of a thing I think is kind of intriguing about looking at Islam. I mean, again, we were kind of talking about the political differences between Christian Europe and the Muslim world, is the idea that the way that authority kind of springs out of religion. I mean, let's say just a commander like Saladin. I mean, his legitimacy comes from the idea that he is the advocate of the Muslim community. He's the defender of the broader Muslim community. And that's a lot different than, say, like, I don't know, the King of England. He's a king of a political unit, but also he's got obligations as a Christian ruler too. It's not like he's like, all of a sudden he is the advocate for all of Christendom. I mean, I guess the Pope really has that role. And so you get the division between church and state. Whereas with the Muslim world, it's kind of more all one thing. I mean, is that kind of the impression you get too, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. And another thing too, not to sound pedantic, but I mean, it also depends like where and when. I mean, because these,
right,
these political, these sort of the way, religious authority in Islam is construed changes a lot. Really a big breaking point is the Mongol invasions and the final, end of the caliphate. I mean, that's a pretty serious transition. But I think, it's interesting how the Islamic tradition interprets authority. I mean, because a good example of this, there's the famous Ottoman Muslim traveler Ibn Battuta, and the reason why he's able to sort of do so much and kind of fund himself is because he's a Islamic judge, and basically, if you educate yourself, you can just go be a Islamic scholar or judge. I mean, you don't have to be necessarily even formally educated if you sort of know the Quran and the Hadith, the sort of the sayings of the Prophet and his companions. You can be an authority, and it also happens in something pretty important in Ottoman history is the Sufis, the mystic tradition. Same kind of thing. It's I guess maybe there's definitely a top-down structure, but it's also more decentralized compared to, let's say, Latin Christianity.
So this has been a really interesting conversation, Sam. I'm glad you were able to come on and do this. I'd like to
Yeah,
actually
sure.
have you come on again. We're kind of getting toward the end here, but I
Okay.
want to end with just probably an appropriate question. What do you think? Uh, what do you think kind of led to the eventual? I mean, obviously, all powers declined eventually, but what do you think kind of led to the eventual decline of the Ottomans? And is there a moment where you kind of see that as really coming into play? Like, is there a moment, for example, where the West kind of starts to have the edge over the Ottomans?
Yeah, traditionally people say it's like in the late 16th century. That was sort of the standard interpretation for a long time. Um, and part of that was based on what Ottoman writers at that time were saying themselves. But for me, I would say it's really not until you get into the 19th century where they have some pretty serious structural problems that just don't get resolved. And when they do start to resolve them, basically before World War One, with the institution of the Committee of Union and Progress, the war happens, and any sort of reform efforts, well, World War One, destroys it. So I think when the history of empires, you have to take it in like how should I put this? You can't look at it like a linear rise and fall. For me, I don't find that very helpful.
Yeah, that's a good
Because
point.
it's too abstract. You're not talking about like specific people and things that happen. You're just saying like, okay, well, they reached this point and then it was all over. Ottoman after Suleiman, I mean, there's a period of crisis. By the mid 17th century, they're kind of able to reform things. There's another sort of crisis period in the early 18th century, and then they're kind of able to restructure things. So it's like that, and you can really apply that to a lot of different historical empires. It's not a linear process necessarily.
All right, awesome. This is really fascinating, Sam. I mean, I don't know that much about the Ottomans, so it's cool to get to have you on to talk about some of this stuff. I think everybody had fun too, so I appreciate the questions from everybody, so we can kind of dive into the Ottomans a bit more. So yeah, let's just kind of. Well, actually, let me jump up here. It looks like we actually got a power chat. Let me see here. It's from Sheila. She says, "I don't have a question. Just this is so fascinating. I've only recently become interested in this time of history." Well, thank you very much, Sheila. We appreciate that.
If you don't mind, could I address one of the questions from Xenix?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The Xenix is asking about the Ottoman Roman pretensions, Rum and whatnot. Yeah, this is something that gets trotted out in a lot of like popular histories. I think for kind of silly reasons. So yeah, the Ottomans use the name of Rum to describe Anatolia, and sometimes in the Ottoman chronicles and documents that I read, they will use kind of tactically Kayseri Rum, which is Caesar of Rome, basically Turkified. But that's not really their example for political authority. It's more of a Persianate tradition, and it's the sort of the Persian model of kingship that goes back. I mean, even before Islam. Talking like classical Persia. That's kind of its roots. But if they call the Sultan as the Padishahi Humayun, it's a very Persian title. It's not. So the Roman kind of invocation, it does come up, there's reason for it, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's an overwhelming aspect of the way they sort of conceive of things. So I hope that's a good answer there, Xenix.
So maybe like the idea that they saw themselves as the successors of the Roman Empire probably is a bit overplayed, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, like Mehmed II, I think the one that conquers Constantinople, I mean, there's evidence that he definitely thought that way. I mean, but again, that's sort of him in that time, not sort of something that I see necessarily when I like sit and like read the sources and how they refer to the Sultan and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Lambert here says, thanks, Sam and Jay Stephen. Great discussion. Well, thank you, Lambert.
Yeah, I think I'm happy to talk about this stuff. And yeah.
No, it was really fascinating. And I mean, there's so much other stuff we could talk about. So yeah, if you want to come, I mean, I'd almost like to have you come back next month if you want to, Sam, and we'll just
sure. Yeah.
do this again and kind of touch on some more Ottoman topics. So, okay, guys. Well, thanks. That's kind of the end for now. But we'll have another stream on Friday. So we do this Coffee in the Crusades every Tuesday and Friday. It's at 12 noon Eastern time and 11 a.m. Central time, U.S. time, and I guess it's 7 p.m. in Istanbul. Is that right, Sam?
Yes, that's correct.
So, all right, great. Okay, guys, we'll see you next time, and we will definitely have Sam back for a future talk on the Ottomans.
Sure, sounds good.
Then.
Okay, it was very nice being on, and thanks for all the questions. They were great.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.